target an element inside of CSS, there exist a couple of different selectors. The first selector is the element selector. You can use the element selector by going inside of your linked style sheet. So we've linked our style sheet by using the link tag right here. We've linked our style.css file, and now we can use an element selector by just using the element name. So in our case, we want to style an h1 tag. So the element name is h1. We are going to use opening and closing brackets right here. And inside of those brackets, we can now define our style. So we can say color should, for example, be blue. We're going to save this, and now our heading has a blue color. And to show you that this really works, we can also say that we want to have a p tag with some placeholder tag. And now the element selector would have the name p essentially, because the element is a p element, so a paragraph element. So we can say p will have a color of yellow, for example, which will look terrible, but as you can see, we now have a yellow color. The next selector we can use is the class selector. So we can also go to our tag inside of HTML and give this one a class of, for example, my-heading. Now we can copy this class name, go inside of our style sheet. We're going to delete both of those selectors, and by using dot and the name of the class right here, we can use the class selector. So now we've again selected our h1 right here, but this time we've used a class name. And now we can say we want to have a color, for example, of aqua, for example. And now we have an aqua color right here. Besides the class selector, we can also use the ID selector. So let's say our paragraph has an ID, for example, of info-text. So now we've defined an ID for this paragraph, and we can target an ID by using the route instead of the point, followed by the ID name. So this is how you select an ID. Now again, opening and closing brackets. And let's say we want to use a color, for example, of, again, let's say beige. And now we have this text, which is barely visible because the color is pretty similar to white. Now there also exists the universal selector, which is just an asterisk. Again, we can use opening and closing brackets. And now we can just say, okay, let's use a color of red, for example. We're going to save this. And as you can see, now our paragraph as well as our h1 are red. And the reason is that the universal selector usually selects every single element. So now let's delete this. And let me show you some other selectors. Let's imagine we are having a div, for example. And inside of this div, we're going to have a paragraph. And inside of this paragraph, we have a couple of words, for example. And let's duplicate this paragraph, for example. So now we have this paragraph twice. And let's create a third paragraph that probably has a text last paragraph. So now imagine we wanted to select those paragraphs right here. In order to do so, we could essentially say that we want to target every p tag that is inside of a div. And this is really simple. We can just say, let's target a div that has a paragraph inside of it. And by using this syntax, you're saying we're targeting every p tag inside of a div. So now let's use this syntax, and we're going to say color is going to be red, for example, or Rebecca purple. And as you can see, now we have those texts that are essentially Rebecca purple, while the last paragraph that is not inside of a div does not have a color at all. But now let's imagine we would have another div, for example. And one of those p tags is inside of another div. Let's say this div has a class of, for example, container. And this div has a class of subcontainer, for example. So now if we would say, for example, dot container p, as you can see, we still have the same effect. And the reason for this is that this container is essentially a wrapper for this div and is essentially a wrapper for this paragraph and a wrapper for this paragraph. So both of those paragraphs are inside of this container div. So as you can see, it doesn't matter how deeply nested a paragraph is. By using this syntax, the effects will be applied. But if you just want to target the direct child, you have to use this symbol right here. And as you can see, now I'm going to save, and only the direct child will get this color, while the nested child will not have that color anymore because it's not a direct child of the container div. It's a direct child of the subcontainer div, but it's not a direct child of the container div. Now there also exists the adjacent selector, and let me demonstrate you by using a couple of p tags, for example. Every p tag will have a couple of words inside, and we're just going to duplicate it 4 times, for example. And let's say our first p tag will have a class of first, for example. So now we can say we want to target our first element But let's imagine we wanted to target this p tag right here. So the first p tag that follows the p tag with the class first. And in order to target that one, we can use a plus symbol. So now we can say first dot first plus p, which essentially means select the first p tag that follows the element with a class of first. So this could also be a div right here. That wouldn't really matter too much. So we can just use a div here and it wouldn't really make a difference because it still has the same exact class. We're going to save this and we're going to say, give that p tag a color of blue, for example. And as you can see, now our second p tag has a color of blue because this is the first p tag that follows an element with a class of first. If we wanted to select every single one, we would need to use this symbol right here, which essentially means select every single sibling on the same level. We're going to save this, and as you can see, we've now targeted every single sibling on the same level. So essentially everyone next to this p tag. If you would have a div afterwards and a p tag afterwards with some words, as you can see, p tag would still be affected while the div would not be affected because the div is essentially not a p tag. So not a p tag that is a direct sibling to our .first class. Essentially, let me show you some tricks at the end. We also have, let's imagine we have an h1 that has some words. Let's imagine we have an h2, for example, that also has some words. And let's say we have an h3 as well. And that one has a word as well. So now if we wanted to target all of them at the same time, we could say h1, comma, h2, comma, h3. And now we can define the styles for all three elements at once by saying color is equal to aqua, for example. And as you can see, all elements have the color aqua right now. We could also use some stacking, for example. So we can, for example, say class, and this one has, for example, class heading and class of hey bro, for whatever reason. And now we could say that we want to target our h1, for example, that has a class of dot heading, for example. And now we say this one should have a color of red or Rebecca purple. And as you can see, we've targeted that class right here. And it would also work if we would go ahead and say, okay, let's say we are going to write dot hey bro 1, for example. So this is wrong. So if we're going to delete the 1 right now, this is true, and we're getting this effect. So this syntax essentially means target an h1 that also has the class of heading and also has the class of hey bro. And if one of those things is not fulfilled, we are not going to apply the style. So if this one is hey bro 2, for example, so that class does not exist for the element, even though heading and h1 is essentially true, it is not going to apply the style. So all of those properties essentially need to be true to apply those styles. And sometimes you also have some attributes. So let's, for example, say we are going to use an anchor tag, which obviously usually has an href attribute that is probably going to target whatever site, doesn't really matter though, and probably has a text of Google. So we're going to have this anchor tag. And now we can say that we want to target every anchor tag that essentially, for example, let's say that has an empty string. Wouldn't make really too much sense in a real world application, but let's imagine we are going to target every anchor tag that has an empty attribute href. And we can do so by saying, let's target an a tag that has, and we're going to use those brackets right here to define an attribute. And now inside of these brackets, we can, for example, say if an anchor tag has an href that is equal to empty quotes, we can apply a color of, let's say, for example, brown. We're going to save this, and as you can see, now we have brown color for this Google attribute. If you would say Google right here, for example, and going to save this, you can see that the brown color disappears. And the reason is that this anchor tag does not have the attribute of href equals Google anymore. But if we are going to go into our index.html and say href is equal to Google, for example, now those brackets become true again, and we are going to apply the style again.